Good afternoon, my name is John Schmitz. I'm the archivist and historian for the Chautauqua Institution, and I wish to welcome you to this afternoon's Heritage Lecture. Before we start, one thing I'd like to clarify. If you hear or read anywhere that our hours that we are open at the archives are anything other than Monday through Friday, 10 to 3. Okay, Monday through Friday, 10 to 3. Not just Wednesday, and not on Saturday as well. Just Monday through Wednesday, 10 to 3. We're trying to get this cleaned up, but Monday through Friday, 10 to 3, yeah. And it's in the pamphlet there, yeah. The other thing is, I'd like to draw your attention to the lecture next week. Do any of you remember Lawrence Welk? And then you remember that those shows were and still are a lot of fun. There's a lot of good talent in them, but you're also going to remember the clothes, right? That was a part of the show, was the wardrobe. And next week we're going to hear from Howard Kurtz, who's a costume curator and historian. He's been here 3 times before speaking in the lecture series. And he had a chance to meet and interview the wardrobe designer. So he will be presenting on that next Tuesday, but not here. It will be in the Hall of Christ because he needs to have visuals in order to do that. But same time, 3:30. The seating is limited in the Hall of Christ, but if you can, I think it's really going to be quite interesting to attend. Well, today I'm very, very happy to welcome back to the Heritage Lecture Yari Villanueva. Now, he is or was one of the men who would play taps at Arlington Cemetery. He's a retired lieutenant colonel from the Air Force. He is also a very good historian and collector of records, and knows his stuff extremely well. He's, I would say, the world's expert on bugle calls, actually. So I'm very happy that he has agreed to come here again and speak to us. So please welcome him. You're also going to learn about O.W. Norton. If you don't know about O.W. Norton, he's going to tell you about him. He and the Norton family are extremely important to the history of Chautauqua. Yari?
Thank you. Thank you, John. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really honored to be here. And just to set the record straight, I did not retire as a lieutenant colonel with the Air Force. However, I retired as a lieutenant colonel with the Maryland Defense Force, which is the Maryland State Militia. After I retired from the Air Force, I still wanted to continue service in uniform. So when I went to work for the National Guard as the Director of Military Funeral Honors for the state, I joined the state militia and worked with them for 10 years and was able to retire as a lieutenant colonel in the militia. Doesn't count towards my pension, but it's a very nice thing to have on my resume. Well, today we're going to talk about the bugler who first sounded the call of taps. You know, when did it happen? And, you know, what did he do after his time in the Army? And of course, I'm talking about Oliver Willcox Norton. Now, there's much known about him, and it's fitting that we spend a little time today reviewing the life of this remarkable man. Oliver Willcox Norton, O.W. to his family and friends, was born in Angelica, New York, in Allegheny County on December 17, 1839. He was the son of Oliver William Norton, a Presbyterian minister, and his wife Henrietta. Oliver was the oldest of 13 children. Yeah, those ministers. He had actually 7 with his first wife, Henrietta, and 6 with his second wife, Sarah. Reverend Norton moved his family around often in the years before the Civil War. He was an itinerant preacher, minister, preached at many churches and in different places. And O.W. received his education at the Montrose Academy in Montrose, Susquehanna County, Pennsylvania. He's listed in the public school rolls in 1857, and then he attended a private school in Sherman, New York. The family moved to Chautauqua County, where Reverend Norton preached at Open Meadows near the town of Sherman. And O.W. began to teach in the district school at Waits Corner in 1858. The family moved once again to Springfield, Pennsylvania, just west of Erie, in 1860. And it was here that O.W. was teaching and working on a farm when the Civil War began. Oliver Willcox Norton was among the first to enter the Union Army when the Civil War broke out. On April 21st, 1861, he was mustered into Company G of the Erie Regiment. This regiment was formed for 3 months of service, and after training at Camp Wilkins near Pittsburgh, the regiment returned to Erie and then disbanded in July after seeing no action. Then following the disaster of Bull Run, a new regiment was formed for a 3 years enlistment of service. This was the 83rd Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry. O.W. enlisted with Company K and became the bugler for that unit. The 83rd wore very colorful French uniforms that were imported for the war. And I have a photograph up here of young Oliver in that French-style uniform, a French chasseur. It was a very bright uniform which consisted of a shako, bright-colored jacket, and very wide trousers. They proved to be quite colorful on the parade field, but very unsuitable for use in the field. And these uniforms were left behind and replaced with the regulation blue uniform when the regiment marched off to war. Now, the 83rd Pennsylvania was organized into a brigade that consisted of 2 other New York infantry units and 1 from Michigan. That brigade was under the command of Daniel Butterfield. Now, let me just take a few seconds here and divert from Oliver Willcox Norton to talk a little bit about Daniel Butterfield, because that's a name that's going to pop up quite a bit in my talk. Daniel Butterfield came from Utica, New York. He was the son of John Butterfield, who was a prominent businessman in Utica before the war. John Butterfield's biggest success was starting the American Express Company, an overland express company to move goods from St. Louis to the West Coast. In fact, when the government was reaching out to businesses to see who could provide this service, the Butterfield Company beat out these guys named Wells and Fargo for a federal contract. Anyway, Daniel was the son of John Butterfield. He went to school in Schenectady, New York, at Union College. Then came back to New York to work for his father, and then, as most young men did at that time, joined the New York militia, the 12th New York, as a private, but then rose through the ranks to become the colonel of that group. When the Civil War started, he took that regiment to Washington, and his big claim to fame is that he was at the head of all the troops that marched across the Long Bridge from Washington, D.C. over into Virginia at the beginning of the Civil War. He was then given a command of a brigade and slowly rose through the ranks and eventually became the chief of staff of the Army under George Meade. But he's also known for something else that we'll come back in just a little bit about that. Now, when the 83rd joined this brigade, there was a bond of friendship that was formed between the 83rd and the 44th New York Regiment. And they became known as the Butterfield Twins because they liked to fight side by side during battles. And these regiments, these four regiments, the 83rd Pennsylvania, the 44th New York, the 16th Michigan, and then another regiment which was to join them, all became part of the brigade, which was known as Butterfield's Brigade. Now, during this time, Norton was that bugler in the 83rd, and as soon as he went into the Army, he started writing letters. He wrote home during the war, and these letters provide an insight into his duties as a bugler, as an orderly, flag bearer, and also life in general as a soldier. And they are collected in a book called Army Letters, which he wrote in 1903 and published for private circulation. Now, nearly 2/3 of the approximately 150 letters were written to his sister, Elizabeth Lane Norton. She was also known as Libby, and in his letters, he would address her as Sister L. She married a farmer and had moved to Sherman, New York area in 1862. And according to the family, Libby was very active in the Underground Railroad system and helped slaves, runaway slaves escape to Canada. After the war, she became involved with the women's club, the Minerva Club, and worked to establish a free library in Sherman, New York. Now, the letters, and I'm going to read from some of these letters because they're pretty neat. I'm not going to read all 150, of course. I'm going to concentrate on the ones that talk about the bugle, since I brought my bugle with me. Of course, the bugle is very important during the Civil War. The Civil War marks the transition from the use of the fife and the drum as the primary signaling instrument to the bugle. By the end of the Civil War, most of the signals that were giving out to troops were given by the bugle. And the reason is that in the new type of warfare experienced during the Civil War, it was very hard to distinguish drum beats with artillery fire. However, a bugle could be heard nice and clear over the din of the battle. In fact, it was written into regulations by 1863 that, and let me quote from the regulation, that every officer will make himself perfectly acquainted with bugle signals and should, by practice, be enabled, if necessary, to sound them. This knowledge, so necessary in general instruction, becomes of vital importance on actual service in the field. Now that's kind of interesting because Butterfield liked also to play the bugle. So not only did he know the bugle calls, every once in a while he would pick up a bugle and play it himself. So Oliver Willcox Norton joined the Army, and of course he starts writing letters home. And one of his first letters comes in October of 1861 at Camp Leslie near Falls Church in Fairfax County, Virginia. And he writes, "I commenced writing yesterday, but was obliged to stop to attend drill, a very common incident in soldier life. The first thing in the morning is drill, then drill again, then drill, and a little more drill, then drill, and lastly drill. Between drills, we would drill and sometimes stop to eat a little and have a roll call." Now, if you recognize that particular quote, it was used in the Ken Burns series, the very first episode. Unfortunately, it's not quoted, but it comes from Oliver Willcox Norton. Now, Butterfield, as I mentioned, liked bugle calls. And now since Butterfield was in charge of a whole brigade, he wanted to have something to identify that brigade. During the din of battle, many bugle calls would be sounded and nobody would know exactly, well, was that bugle call for us or was that for that other regiment or that other brigade? So Butterfield came up with an idea where he would have a short prelude call that would be sounded, and then the call that would follow it would be for the brigade. And it became known as the Dan Butterfield Call. And this is what it sounds like. Real short. Okay. The next call that would follow would be for that brigade. Became known as the Dan Butterfield Call because soldiers started singing, Dan, 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 Butterfield, Butterfield, okay? And then they would know the next call would be for them. Butterfield talked about that call quite a bit. In fact, he said that after the war, if he would be at a train station or something and he would recognize somebody, he would whistle it softly, and then if the recognition went up, he would know, oh, comrade, so good to see you again. He also said that when it got trying times during the battle, instead of the men singing Dan, 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 Butterfield, they would sing Dan, 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 Butterfield, Butterfield. So that's the Butterfield Call. Well, Norton writes a little bit about that. And he says in 1862, he writes, "Dear brothers and sisters, my duty exempts me from guard and picket duty. While at Yorktown, bugles and drums were not used, so I had nothing to do. So I went into the ranks again and volunteered to do picket duty and work in the trenches, and took my regular turn in all the work of the regiment except camp guard, which I always had an aversion to and wouldn't do it if not required to. We had a corps of 12 buglers when we left Fort Monroe, and I was the leader. But finding that a good many more than was necessary, the colonel dismissed all but 2, Lettier and myself. Now I'll give you an idea of our duties. At sunrise, the buglers at the headquarters sound the brigade call. And then the reveille. And it's very interesting, in his letter here, he phonetically spells reveille, because if you look at the word, and if you know French, it's pronounced réveil, okay? And most of our, well, not most of it, just about every one of our infantry bugle calls were taken from the French manuals. So the American pronunciation became reveille. Well, you know the rest, right? And the words, of course, are, I can't get them up, I can't get them up, I can't get them up in the morning, right? And those are the family-friendly words. And the buglers of each regiment, as quickly as possible, assembled on the color line and give their regimental call, and they repeat the reveille. The fifes and drums follow and awaken the men. This is the signal to rise and fall in for roll call. You may guess that the buglers of an army of 30,000 men, all within sound of each other, make some music. At sunset, we have another call, the retreat. That's the call, actually, that sounded in the afternoon as another roll call. Today, retreat means the lowering of the flag and the end of the duty day. At 8:30, that's the tattoo is sounded. Here is the tattoo. It's the longest call in the infantry manual, and it's interesting the reason we have a tattoo call, and it's also the last roll call of the day. The tattoo dates back to the 12th century when drummers would beat the drum call as they went into town to have the soldiers return to the garrison from their evening out. And it would also tell the barkeeps to turn off the taps, no more liquor for the soldiers. Tattoo may be taken from the Dutch, taptoe. The Dutch is do din tap toe, which basically translates as turn off the taps. It meant, of course, soldiers return back to camp or garrison and fall in for the last roll call. The bugle eventually takes over sounding the call, and during the Civil War, this is what the tattoo sounded like. And as with tattoo calls today, you can actually almost hear the bugler singing tattoo, tattoo at the very end. Isn't that a beautiful call? So, since he describes it, he played it. Going on, and at 9 o'clock, the extinguished lights. The call, of course, to turn off all the lights and go to sleep. Here's that call. Probably wasn't the call you were expecting. But that's the call in 1862 to go to sleep, okay? Comes from the French, to extinguish lights. Napoleon's favorite bugle call, by the way. Then he talks about, he says, there are calls to strike the tents. That's known as the pack 'em up call. Pack 'em up, pack 'em up, pack 'em up, pack 'em up. And that basically, we got to go, take the tents down, fall in. We're going to get out of here. There was also to the color, to assemble, sick call, officers call, etc. Okay. He said it's also our duty to repeat all such calls that are first sounded at headquarters, and then on the march, the order to march, to halt, to lie down. In fact, all the orders are given by the bugle, as he said. Now, I just played a few of calls, but there were 50 of them in the infantry alone. So, and people say, well, how in the world did those soldiers know them? Well, they heard them every single day. And then they started putting words to them. Now, Norton became the brigade bugler and sounded taps for the first time while serving under General Daniel Butterfield. As I said before, Butterfield knew the calls, and he could even sound them as mentioned by Norton in a letter. He wrote home saying, "I'm sending you a Harper's, thinking that you don't often see them. You see a good portrait of our little Dan. If I ever get home, I'll show you the bugle he took from my hand to sound the charge at Bull Run. I'm so proud to see him now as the chief of staff on Hooker's staff." Well, Butterfield, of course, like I said, liked bugle calls. In June of 1862, following let me go back just a little bit. In the spring of 1862, General McClellan, who was head of the Army, decided to attack Richmond, to take Richmond. And he came up with the idea to float the entire army down the Potomac to the tip of the peninsula of Virginia, where Fort Monroe is, and then have the army move up past Yorktown, Williamsburg, to try and take Richmond from the south. Unfortunately, he was very slow in doing that. The army moved up the peninsula at an incredibly slow pace, so much so that McClellan in the papers was being referred to as Virginia Creeper. At the end of June, they finally met the Confederate Army under the new command of Robert E. Lee, and Lee successfully was able to defend Richmond in a series of battles that was known as the 7 Days Battles. The Union Army fought against the Confederate. The last battle was on Malvern Hill, which was actually a Union victory. After that battle, the Army moved to the banks of the James River, south of Richmond, where they were to camp for 2 months. McClellan made his headquarters at the old Harrison Mansion on what the grounds today is the Berkeley Plantation along the James River. In that, where all those soldiers were camped, was the Brigade with Daniel Butterfield. And Butterfield, of course, every night would hear the call for extinguished lights. And what would happen after that call was sounded is that a lone drummer on the parade field would then hit the drum 3 times. Boom, boom, boom. That was the drum signal also for lights out, extinguished lights. Soldiers called that the drum taps. So now the bugle, when it started to play a new call, what would they name that new call? Taps. Now, Butterfield, since he didn't like that call, asked Oliver Willcox Norton from the 83rd to join him in his tent, where he showed him some music that was written down and said, "Would you play this call tonight?" For a little bit, they reworked this call over, and they made some notes longer, shortened some notes there, but otherwise then turned it into those 24 notes that we know today as the bugle call of taps. And it was first performed down along the James River at Harrison's Landing in July of 1862. It then soon catches on, and all the Union buglers are playing now this new taps instead of the regulation extinguished lights. In fact, there were some other Confederate units that probably started playing that call too. So we'll come back to taps in just a little bit, because I want to try and focus mostly on Oliver. When Butterfield ascended to become the Army Chief of Staff, O.W. served under Colonel Strong Vincent. That's another, Vincent, of course, is another important name here at Chautauqua. Vincent was the 3rd commander of the 83rd Pennsylvania Volunteers. The first was John McLean, who actually had formed the regiment. and he was unfortunately killed on June 26, 1862, during the Battle of Gaines Mills. Then Captain Hugh Campbell was an interim commander, but then resigned from the Army to accept an appointment as a provost marshal in the 9th Congressional District of Pennsylvania. Strong Vincent was elected to colonel of the 83rd, and he assumed command of the entire brigade after Butterfield left to assume his new duties. Now, real quickly, for those of you who may not understand how an army works and how it's formed, at its basic level, you have a company of about 100 men, okay? You take 10 of those, put those together, and about 1,000 men, you have a regiment, okay? You take 3 or 4 regiments, put them together, they become a brigade. Then you take 4 brigades, put them together, they become a division. And then take anywhere from 2 to 5 divisions. You see how the number gets bigger, bigger, bigger. You put 4 or 5 of those together, and they become an Army Corps. So the brigade that Strong Vincent now inherits is the 3rd Brigade of the 1st Division of the 5th Army Corps. Okay, they all have a specific number, and they also have specific colors too. So now Strong Vincent assumes that command, and it's while a member, of course, of the 83rd, Norton meets Vincent for the first time, and he becomes acquainted with him, and they are to have a lifelong association with the Vincent family. Now, what did O.W. think of Strong Vincent on first meeting him? Not very much. He said, my first recollection of him is his appearance as adjutant, and I confess that my first impression of him was not favorable. I thought him a dude and an upstart. Well, it just goes to show you that sometimes, first impressions can be misleading. Strong Vincent was born on June 17, 1837. He was educated at Trinity College and also graduated from Harvard in 1859. He practiced law in Erie and was a prominent citizen in the community. He enlisted as a private in the Erie Regiment and then promoted to first lieutenant and adjutant. He then became the adjutant with the 83rd Regiment when that was reformed. He proved himself to be an able soldier and adjutant, busy with organizing and training the new recruits. He married Elizabeth Carter, she was known as Lizzie, on April 25th, 1861. Now, Norton became the headquarters bugler and color bearer when Strong Vincent took command of the entire brigade. And Norton had a horse for his duties and enjoyed extra privileges as such. Let me read, just go back here. This is a letter that he wrote home about the privileges of a bugler. This is kind of interesting. And the family, evidently, when he would write home, they would write back with more questions about exactly what he would do, what he did. So this is dated January 25th, 1863. Dear Sister L, I thought the subject of bugler was exhausted, but I see you want to know more about it. I am the chief bugler of the brigade. My duties are in camp to sound the calls for roll calls, drills, inspections, guard mounting, etc. at regular hours each day. On the march, to attend on the general in command and sound the calls, to march or halt and rest, strike tents and form in line, etc. In short, to act as the mouthpiece for the general. Well, so much for duties. As for privileges, 1, I have nothing to do but bugle. 2, my luggage is carried in the headquarters wagon. That's a pretty good deal. 3, I get better rations than the regiment, and more of them. 4, I get my wood hauled, and in the regiment, the men have to carry all they burn a long distance. Well, therefore, perhaps that's enough. I might add others later. Also, being the headquarters brigade bugler, he also had a horse, which he really enjoyed. But in early April of '63, Norton found himself relieved of his duties. And sad thing to be, as a military person, when you're relieved of your duties, it's usually not for a good reason. So he actually wrote home about it. Wednesday, April 8th, 1863. Dear Sister L, I've been moving, yes, moving, for I am returned to the regiment. So from the brigade back down to the regiment. Colonel Vincent could not be satisfied to let me stay when I had a good berth, but insisted on my coming back. My reward for strict attention is this: retrograde promotion. The colonel's reason for promoting me was to put me in charge of the bugle corps here, to play for dress parade in the place of a band. You may believe I was somewhat vexed about it, and if not that I hoped to get back to headquarters, I would smash my bugle over a stump and take a musket again. If I'd been thrown out of this place for any fault of my own, I would have nothing to say about it. But I did squirm to find that I was only recalled because Colonel Vincent wanted a good bugler in the regiment and cared nothing about what they had at headquarters. Coming back to the regiment seems almost like leaving the comforts of home and enlisting again. I did not realize half the privileges I enjoyed until I came to be deprived of them. So my favorite line, a retrograde promotion. It's a nice way of saying you're fired. But anyway, in June, O.W. did return to headquarters and was by Vincent's side during the Battle of Gettysburg that took place July 1 to 3 in 1863. Norton had a great view, a bird's eye view of the fighting around Little Round Top on the second day. The 83rd was positioned next to Joshua Lawrence's 20th Maine on Little Round Top. Basically, how this all came about was through the efforts of Strong Vincent. If you've ever watched the movie Gettysburg, you see how Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain is somewhat lionized as the greatest hero ever. But in reality, it was through the efforts of Strong Vincent that saved the day on that second day of battle. And of course, the reason is that Chamberlain had the luxury of living after the battle and was able to write about it, his point of view. What happened was that Little Round Top was found to be unoccupied, and General Gouverneur K. Warren, who was the chief engineer of the Army of the Potomac, saw the hill was unoccupied and could be easily captured by the enemy. So he sent immediate call for reinforcements. It was immediately answered by Strong Vincent, who went up the hill without orders. Okay, he wasn't told to go up there, but he sensed that this would be of importance. So he moved his brigade up the hill. He actually, to scope things out, he rode up the hill with Norton, both on horseback. Norton, at this time, not only was carrying this bugle, but he was also carrying the large brigade flag, which was red, white, and blue with a large cross on it. As soon as they got to the top of the hill, they found themselves under enemy fire because the Confederates could see those two up there with that big flag, so they started firing on him. Vincent immediately jumped off the horse and told Norton to take the horses to the rear. Norton takes off with the horses and the flag, and immediately Vincent remembers, oh crap, my sword is on the horse. He forgot his horse. All he has is a riding crop that was a gift from his wife. But he realized that danger immediately of having the position overrun by Confederate forces. Unfortunately, he was mortally wounded on Little Round Top that day and died on July 7th. He was buried with full military honors on July 13. Tomorrow's the anniversary of that, 159 years ago, that he was buried in Erie. Norton, of course, wrote about it. Headquarters, 3rd Brigade, July 17, 1863. Colonel Vincent died on the 7th, as brave and gallant a soldier as ever fell. His commission as Brigadier General was read to him on his deathbed. His loss is felt deeply by the brigade. There is no one to fill his place. No one can march a brigade as he could. Oh, how we loved him, but he is gone. Norton so admired Vincent that he named his youngest son after him. The two men were close in the short time they knew each other. They had to have been. They were 2 years apart in age. Both were educated men. Both had strong views of the war. Both enlisted for patriotic reasons. Both had abolitionist feelings. And it was not uncommon for a bugler and a commander to be close, familiar with each other. The two would have spent much time together. The duties of a bugler required him to be near him at all times. They must have talked, exchanged ideas, and grown to like each other's company. Years later, Vincent's sword, which was given to O.W. to hand down to his son, but the younger Norton had no desire to keep it. There was actually a bit of a family scandal there, and O.W. took the sword back. It is now in the vaults of the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. Too bad, because I really think it needs to be returned to Erie at some point in time. Now, afterwards, bugling and went on for Norton. You know, life as a soldier, the war continued. And not all bugle duties were ones that Norton looked forward to performing. In August of 1863, he wrote, "Dear Sister L, the great event of last week was the execution of 5 deserters from our division, which took place yesterday afternoon. General Griffith sent for me to bugle." So yeah, he had to go and play pieces for an execution. In the fall of 1863, Norton decided, well, he had been thinking about this, he wanted to do something more than be a soldier and a bugler. And so he wrote home from Washington, D.C., "Dear Sister L, you know that with my restless disposition, I could not be contented as a brigade bugler while there was the possibility of doing something better. As long ago as May, I began to work for a commission in a colored regiment. In November 1863, Norton was commissioned as a first lieutenant in the 8th United States Colored Troops. This spoke highly of the man, as he was fully aware that serving in such a position at that time was a death sentence should he ever be captured. For the remainder of the war, O.W. served as a staff officer and regimental quartermaster for the 8th United States Colored Regiment, which fought battles in Florida. His letters at the time back home complained about the poor leadership by some of the officers. Norton put away his bugle for his new duties, and it was a task he enjoyed. He worked hard to learn the business end of supplying an army. This lesson surely aided him in the future. When the war ended, the 8th United States was deployed to Texas for garrison duty, and in November of 1865, O.W. was discharged from the Army. After the war, he belonged to the Grand Army of the Republic, the GAR, and served as the commander for the Illinois Commandery of the Military Order of the Loyal Legion. He wrote of his wartime experiences in 3 books and was instrumental in bringing the true origin of taps to light in 1889. Basically what happened was that a musicologist by the name of Gustav Kabe wrote an article called "The Trumpet in Battle and Camp," describing all the bugle calls of the Civil War. But at the end of the article, he had no idea what taps came from. Norton wrote to him and said, "I know how taps came about," and he wrote back to him, explained how it was formed with Daniel Butterfield, and they also got Daniel Butterfield involved, and he confirmed the story. Now, following his discharge from the Army, Norton worked as a clerk for the Fourth National Bank in New York City, and he lived on Henry Street in Brooklyn near the ferry to Manhattan, and met his future wife, Lucy Fanning. Lucy was born in Albion, New York in 1842. Both of them attended the Plymouth Congregational Church, where they were married in October of 1870. The minister at the wedding was the Reverend Henry Ward Beecher, the famous orator and anti-slavery preacher, and the brother of Harriet Beecher Stowe, the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin. O.W. and Lucy would have 5 children. Gertrude, who unfortunately died in infancy, Ralph, the oldest, Elliot, Ruth, and Strong Vincent. Ruth was unfortunately became an invalid due to a childhood accident. When the family moved here, O.W. had a special ramp that was built down to the lake so she could get into her little boat. O.W. moved to Chicago in the latter part of the 19th century, where he went into business with his younger brother, Edwin. This venture added 2 other partners and became the company of Norton and Fancher, which manufactured cans and sheet metal goods. They eventually changed it to Norton Brothers when a partner retired, and the company prospered under Oliver and Edwin. In 1901, Norton helped found the American Can Company and formed many other companies. And in the meanwhile, became very rich in doing so. And it was about this time that his eyesight began to fail. His blindness may have been hereditary, as his sister, to whom he had written home, also became blind in her later years. Now, he spent the last part of his years, about the last almost 15 years, totally blind, but certainly not handicapped. He wrote and was involved in many social activities. They lived in a large house in Chicago, and for Ruth, his invalid daughter, it was one of the first houses in Chicago to have an elevator installed. Norton's book on Gettysburg, The Attack and Defense of Little Round Top, has been for many years the best eyewitness account of what really happened on that hill on July 2nd, 1863. And Norton was persistent in writing to all those who were present at the battle to capture their views and their remembrances of exactly what happened, also in the correct order. In September of 1889, Norton returned to the hills at Gettysburg as the main speaker for the dedication of the monument for Strong Vincent in the 83rd Pennsylvania. Now, I should stop right there because it's not the Strong Vincent Monument. It's the 83rd Infantry Monument. The rules were at that time you could not have a monument that was dedicated to with the facial features of a specific person. But if you go and look at the 83rd Monument at Gettysburg, that's Strong Vincent. There's no doubt about it. And of course, he brought his bugle with him. And standing on the rocks near where Vincent was mortally wounded, he again sounded the old Brigade call, the Dan Butterfield Call. A great shout went up from many of the veterans below, and they came up, charging up the hill, many of them with tears in their eyes, asking him to sound the call once again. That familiar sound echoing among the rocks where they had fought back, perhaps more vividly than words could do, the memories of the days when they answered so often to its sound. While in Chicago, O.W. became acquainted with Bishop John Vincent, who was a cousin to Colonel Strong Vincent. And Bishop Vincent, of course, the co-founder of Chautauqua. And that friendship led to Norton's interest in Chautauqua and the building of a summer home here in 1901. The house still stands on the lake. I had an opportunity to visit the last time I was here. And after O.W.'s death in 1920, his wife, Lucy, contributed money to build a concert hall on the grounds. Norton Memorial Hall is dedicated to the performing arts and opened in 1929. Although it's not stated, written down, stipulated anywhere, all operas that are performed there are done in English. O.W. also contributed to the building of the Minerva Free Library in Sherman, New York, which opened in 1908. He gave money for its construction, upkeep, and renovations, and also donated books from his personal collection, many of which were inscribed at the front. And I got to see some of them. One of them about artillery said something about, this is one of the most fascinating books I've read about artillery, and then he would sign his name to it. The library also held wartime letters that were written to his family, along with several letters to Mrs. Thayer, who was on the Board of Trustees, that dealt with the construction. The letters that were in the library, unfortunately, did not make it into the book, the Army letters. I guess there were two separate piles of letters. In the 1990s, I visited the library and I was able to view those letters, particularly those ones, like as I mentioned, that were not included. I also found out that the library, the citizens of Sherman were so grateful for the library that every year on the anniversary of his death, they would lower the flag in front of the library to half-staff. And Norton also remained in touch with Colonel Vincent's widow, Elizabeth. They were very close friends, and when she passed away, she left him $250 in her will to be spent, this is great, to be spent on the finest cigars. Norton was an avid cigar smoker most of his life, but by that time, he had stopped smoking. And so when the check arrived, he asked that the money be donated to a black church in Cincinnati, Ohio. And he was so devoted to music, especially American music, which is probably the reason why the operas are done in English. O.W. passed away on October 1st, 1920 in Chicago at the age of 81. His body was cremated, and we don't know what happened with the ashes. I sort of suspect that since he loved this place so much, the family brought the ashes here and may have scattered the ashes into the lake. His wife, Lucy, died in 1933, and she left money in her will to the Orchestra Society of Chicago and also to the Chautauqua Institution. So that's the association with the Norton family. I'm honored that Cynthia Norton is sitting right here. I can't tell you how much that the Norton family has been kind to me in doing my research. I actually got to talk to Norton's granddaughter, Beatrice. I almost forgot the name, and this is bad on me because I have a sister named Beatrice. Anyway, Beatrice was she was in her late 80s, I think, when she talked to me, and I just visiting the archives, got to see the dress that she was married in 1936 in her shoes that's being held here at the archives, along with some photo albums from the 1930s of the Norton family here at Chautauqua. So if you get a chance to visit the archives, I strongly suggest that you make use of that great facility, here, because we're trying to preserve that history. It's so important. So also on the photo here, so we see the young Norton, and then we see the older Norton. The older Norton photo was taken in the 1890s. So that brings up to the close of my program. I'll be happy to take any questions right now. Cynthia, I knew you were going to jump in.